As part of our ongoing commitment to supporting the accurate and transparent reporting of academic research in the media, we've recently announced a series of partnerships with global media organisations: the Conversation Africa, the Education Media Centres in the UK and Australia, and the Australian Science Media Centre. Today we're lucky enough to be joined by a panel of media experts representing some of these organisations. We'll begin with Lyndall Byford, Acting Chief Executive of the Australian Science Media Centre, who'll be discussing why engaging with the media matters. We'll then hand over to the Education Media Centre's Joint Chief Executive, Fran Abrams, who will be sharing her thoughts on how researchers can help improve news reporting. And lastly, Carolyn Southey, Editor of the Conversation Africa, will speak about generating valuable impact for researchers and their institutions. So without further ado, we'll hand over to Lyndall in Australia to start off the presentation. Lyndall. Okay, I think what we might have to do is move on instead to yourself, Fran. You're due to speak second. If we move on to your slides, and then we'll see if we can get Lyndall on a bit later. Is that all right?
Yes, whenever you're ready with the slides, I'll tell you when. I'm the Chief Executive of the Education Media Centre. We work mainly in the UK with academics, and we're run by journalists, so we often talk with academics about how to communicate with the media. We often find there's a bit of a communication gap between what academics want to say and what journalists want to hear. And we like to think of ourselves as a communication service that can match up these two different groups of people. So these are my top 10 tips for dealing with the media. Number one is be strategic. The first thing you have to do when you have a piece of research is to be strategic. Think about what it is that you want to share. Why do you want to share it? And what is it you want to achieve? You've got an impact agenda, which is a phrase used a lot here in the UK, about getting research to a wider audience and making sure that more people will be aware of your research in an international environment. So, why would you want to do this and why now? You need to think about what your research says and where it will be useful. But equally, this might depend on which bit of the world you're in. You want to think about the timing of a release, how you might structure it, and what you might have to say. Possibly try to meet an editor who's already out there and particularly think, why am I doing this? Why now? What do I want to achieve from it? I think that's the key point. Number two is take advice. I'm assuming most people who are attending this webinar would be at university or some other stage in their academic career, and it's likely you'll have access to an organisation which works with the media on a regular basis, such as a press office or a communications officer. You should always be talking with your media office, as they're there to help you and they'll know how best to communicate your research. This might all seem quite scary and you might be worried that your message won't get across in the right way, but there should be someone in your organisation who can give you advice. You don't have to do it on your own. It might seem quite daunting for a lot of you who haven't done it before, but just remember, you're not on your own. Take advice. Number three is don't expect journalists to share your agenda. This is a classic misunderstanding that can happen between academics and journalists. Often, academics are doing research, which is a big breakthrough, might be methodological, for example. You might have a piece of work which is great news for academics. It isn't necessarily great news for journalists. For example, if you did, and I'm making this up completely, a big piece of research on sexting. There's been a lot about sexting in the news in the UK recently. And you were really thrilled, not because of the great findings you had about sexting, but because you'd actually used some really innovative research methods. If you're not interested in having a story about sexting, and you're more concerned about having a story about your innovative research methods, don't put that out to the wider media, because you can't fool journalists. They'll read the paper, they'll have a look at all the stuff about the great methodological breakthrough in the project, but it's not likely to be something they're going to be interested in, and they're going to pick up on the story that they want to run. So you could try to target your research towards media which would be more interested in your type of research and your innovative methods, although there wouldn't be many of those in the mainstream press. But I'd say if there's a message in your research that you're not that interested in talking about, don't put it out there. Journalists will only pick up on what they're interested in, so think about what their agenda might be as well as your own. Just be very clear about the message that you're trying to communicate, and if you think it might not get across there clearly and in the way you want, maybe don't do it. Number 4, do your research. This is really about taking the initiative and making sure that you know what you're doing. Probably you're the expert in your field. You may well be aware of the media, you might listen to the radio and so on, and you'll obviously take an interest in news items, feature items that crop up in the field that you're an expert in. So hopefully you have something close to your heart you want to talk about. There are some journalists out there for whom it's also close to their hearts. And if you try to match up to those journalists, and if you try to look for those journalists who are interested in what you have to say and in your area of expertise, you'll do a lot better. For example, I'm talking with an academic at the moment about widening access in higher education. Now, we might decide to go to a specific journalist on a specialist publication with that because they're following that agenda very closely. You might have an audience that thinks what you have to say is of wider interest, but then you're dealing with less specialist journalists and they're not going to know so much about your area. So it's often about doing your homework on which journalists are going to be the most receptive to what you've got to say. It's very easy to get hold of journalists' contact details online. Do spend some time finding out who's the best person for you to talk to. The next tip is give journalists notice. Again, this is where your press office may come in because you may not know about different journalist demands. Particularly when talking to journalists, the more notice you can give them, the better. When I was working as a journalist in the UK on daily newspapers, we turned things around in a couple of hours. But journalists are much quicker these days. Deadlines are much shorter, particularly in print. They don't have the same amount of time to devote to things, and you may well want to give them a few days' notice. I find nowadays that for print, they generally like at least a couple of days. And if you're talking about longer-term projects, maybe the journalist wants to go out and talk to some real people who may have experienced some of the issues you're talking about, for example, you may want to give them a week or two. You may want to approach them in advance, give them a chance to get their background work done. If you're talking about documentaries, journalists need a lot of time. Don't drop anything on them at the last minute. If it's a documentary idea or a feature idea, even if you think it's a big story, they can't turn it around in a short time. If you're talking about a TV documentary, you're talking months. So think about the journalist timescale before you make contact with them. Next point is having a clear message, delivering it in plain English. I know this sounds like stating the obvious, but it is so difficult for so many academics to do this. Look at the language that's used in a good quality newspaper. I was at an event not that long ago, and I haven't verified this, but somebody said that they could run a computer program which showed you the average reading age of a piece of writing that you're looking at. The average quality broadsheet newspaper has an average reading age of, I think, about 11. Now, you need to use very short words, short sentences, keep it really, really simple and plain. You will already be really familiar with that. If you've had any kind of media training, you'll get the message across much more clearly, but it must be simple and direct. Journalists get hundreds of emails every day and often find it difficult to get beyond the first paragraph. It's too difficult, it's too complex. You need to convey your message in a few words because otherwise you'll lose them. You need to be direct, straightforward. Next point, be interesting. Again, this sounds obvious, but there's an old maxim that dog bites man is not news, man bites dog is news. Don't tell them something they probably already know. It's one of the common responses we get from journalists when we put stuff out there to them. Try to tell them something that's going to surprise them. Try to tell them something that will make them sit up and go, oh, really? I didn't know that. And that might be difficult. It may well be that in your field of research, obviously what you're finding is going to fit in with what other people have found because that's just how it is. So it may well be that you've done some research and actually it's not going to surprise journalists that much because the really big point that you're looking at is already covered by a lot of other research which will have similar findings. But most journalists are going to be interested in something that looks to them like it's new and different. It may well be, of course, that while it's not surprising to you as an academic, because there's a lot of academic research that makes a similar point, it may be a surprise to a journalist because it may not be that widely known to the general public. So give it a go, but do think about what's already been in the newspapers, on the radio and so on, whether you think a journalist will be surprised by what you've got to say to them. Now, here's an example of something we did recently with Taylor and Francis. We work with Taylor and Francis fairly closely. They send us abstracts of papers they've got coming up in their education journals. We read them, we pick out what we think might be of interest to journalists, and Taylor and Francis will put together a press release if they think it's going to be and Taylor and Francis will put together a press release if they think it's going to be of sufficiently significant interest. This was one of the articles we picked up on recently, where we were quite pleased with the outcome. It was a paper whose lead author was Dr. Victoria Goodyear at the University of Birmingham, and it's about a project where they gave young people personal fitness trackers. They looked at how that affected their willingness to participate in physical activity. What we thought was surprising about this was how wearing Fitbits don't make young people more likely to exercise, and in fact they got turned off by them and got rather bored. Taylor and Francis put together a press release. The press release outlines how young people in secondary schools were reluctant to see modern fitness technology, such as Fitbits, introduced into PE lessons. It says the device could potentially be harmful to longer-term health of young people as well. If you go back to the title of the actual paper, it's a lot more academic than that. Young people's use of wearable, healthy lifestyle technology, surveillance, self-surveillance, and resistance. So we worked with Taylor and Francis to turn this into something a lot more accessible, more user-friendly, and free of what I might call nerdy language. So it's about thinking about how, it's what I call the grandma test. If you were talking to your grandma about this, or a friend over coffee, how would you do that? Would you talk about the young people's use of wearable, healthy lifestyle technology, surveillance, self-surveillance and resistance? Or would you talk about how Fitbit technology actually affects young people's willingness to participate in activity? You'd probably do the latter, wouldn't you? So it's thinking about how to do it in straightforward English. And that's what we do and what Taylor and Francis can do as well. I thought this was a great example of a piece of research we put out to the media, which got great pickup. The academic, Victoria Goodyear, gave an interview which appeared on Sky News' Breakfast show. The story was then syndicated to lots of local radio stations around the UK. There was also excellent pickup in Sweden. One of the other authors is Swedish and did some great work promoting the research there. And the other thing Victoria did was to write a piece for The Conversation. I think we have a slide of that, which is another fantastic way of getting your research out there. You might want to get your research in the mainstream media, but also social media is a great way to back that up. One of the other authors was very active on social media, Twitter in this case, so that's another thing to consider if you're doing a media release. How else can I boost the coverage of this? And just being active, talking to people who are interested on Twitter and so on. You may well find that if you're on Twitter, you're followed by people who are interested in your area, and that means you can get stuff out there more effectively when it comes to promoting your research. Next point, consider the time factor. How much free time have you got? Thinking about getting the time of your research out there, and perhaps aiming for a quiet news day when journalists are likely to be more receptive, is helpful. So it's partly about your time, and it's partly about the journalist's time. If there's a big news story going on, it won't be helpful. So you've got to try and match those two things up. Next point, stay in your comfort zone. This is just a little hint, as I know a lot of academics feel uncomfortable about working with the media, especially those who are not very experienced. And I'd say, if you're unsure, take small steps. I've done this recently with an academic who was very nervous, and actually 6 months ago she was really not sure she wanted to talk about her work in a wider sphere at all. And I think if you feel nervous, don't do a live interview with Breakfast Telly straight away. Get some media training first. Don't put yourself in a position where you're going to be terrified. What I did with that particular academic was to help her to pitch an article to The Conversation. And that worked really well. She wrote an article which was about literacy in the film I, Daniel Blake. The Conversation were delighted with it. It got great hit rates. And she was so pleased with it. And so her confidence was so boosted, she went on to do another one. And she's going to, I'm sure, do more in the future. So just start small is what I'd say. Don't put yourself in a place where you're going to feel scared. Just take a few steps at once. And then hopefully you'll be at the beginning of that journey. And finally, remember that journalists are human. If you do get something out there with a journalist in a newspaper or on broadcast and find it a useful experience, the chances are they're going to call you again when something comes up in their field. So that would be really helpful. You can establish a relationship. So if you have a good experience, say thank you. Get back to them. Mention something you've got coming up in a few months, perhaps. That way, you'll be starting a conversation. Journalists want news stories and they want contact. So treat them as human beings. Things don't go well, you can always get back to them and say that you're not happy. But generally, I would say specialist journalists on specialist publications do want to get things right, and they do want to help you with that. So treat them as humans, do try to enjoy it. It can be great fun working with the media. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fran, for a really interesting presentation there. Some really excellent points, which I'm sure we'll take away. If I can ask you to mute your line now, we'll hand over to Lyndall. So I will just get your slides up, Lyndall. Hopefully you can unmute yourself, and then you'll be able to join us. So just bear with me while I get your slides a sec.
No worries, and apologies for not being there at the beginning. My audio seemed to have cut out for some reason.
Okay, Lyndall, are you free to start now? We should have your slides on the screen.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Daniel, and thanks to Fran for filling in the introductory segment for me. So I'm really going to cover why you should talk to the media. And I know from speaking to lots of scientists that, you know, their experience with the media can often feel like, you know, going to the beach on a really, really rough day, and you either come out of that experience exhilarated after, you know, having caught this amazing wave and just riding it into shore, or you get dumped by it and you end up with sand in every orifice that you can think of, and you swear you'll never do it again. So hopefully I can at least encourage you to keep doing it, and the more you do it, the more likely it's going to be that you have that first experience of riding a nice wave and really finding the positives in the experience. Next slide. Thanks. So I thought we should talk about why you should bother doing it in the first place. And essentially, if you're not talking to the media about your research, then you're not talking to the public. And for a lot of scientists around the world, their science is publicly funded, and there is an obligation with publicly funded science to communicate the results of that work back to the public. And there's been several polls, certainly done here and in the UK, that have shown that about 90% of the public get their information about science from the mainstream news media. And for most people, that's just in passing. So they're not actively seeking out science or technology news stories. They're just going, you know, to the front page of the ABC or the BBC, and there happens to be a science story there that they consume. Next slide. But we're doing pretty badly still on science literacy. So unfortunately, a survey in Australia that's a few years old, I don't think they've done it again, but you know, there's still almost a third of Australians that think dinosaurs and humans coexisted. And if you think that stat's bad, I think it's about 40% in the US, where they have also done the same survey. So we've got a long way to go before we have a really scientific, literate and engaged public. Next slide. And I think probably the most important thing for academics to remember is that if you don't speak, it doesn't mean that the story goes away. In most cases, they will just keep going down the list and down the list of experts and contacts that they've got until they find someone that will. And in many cases, they may end up with someone like this, who anyone in the UK will probably know. He's Lord Monckton, fancies himself as an expert in climate science, no experience, no papers, no academic record in climate change, but absolutely will jump at any media opportunity to get out and say climate change is rubbish. So if you don't take those media interview opportunities, someone else will, and it could be someone with an agenda to push rather than someone who is coming from an evidence-based. Next slide. And look, the other reason to engage in the media is that it's actually a really good way to talk to politicians and, you know, leaders, policy leaders and things like that. Because although you can write as many letters to a politician as you like about your area of interest, but when something hits the mainstream news media, that's when politicians start paying attention to that particular topic. And an example I give is the Fukushima nuclear disaster that obviously happened in Japan a few years ago, and the UK's education more about nuclear radiation from the UK Science Media Centre's expert reactions and the media coverage that generated than she ever did at school being taught about nuclear radiation. So it is a real opportunity to not only inform the public, but to inform the people who are making policy and making decisions at government. Next slide. But let's be really selfish about why you should engage with the media. And ultimately, if your research appears in the media, you are more likely to be cited by your peers. So it is good for your career to get mainstream media coverage for your work. You're also more likely to come up with new collaborators, to get funding. All of those things require people to know who you are and know what work you're doing. And the mainstream media is read by people in your area of science just as it's read by the general public. So there's a couple of studies I can show you to back this up. Next slide. One was in the New York Times. And interestingly, the New York Times printers actually went on strike for a month. So the paper was still created, the journalists still wrote the stories, the editors still put the paper together, but it just wasn't printed. So it was a really unique time to actually look at the impact that the research stories being printed and circulated in a mainstream publication like the New York Times has on circulation. And in this study, they actually compared in the first year after publication how many citations things got if they were publicized by the New York Times versus when they weren't, and found that that publication in just that one news outlet meant that those papers got 72% more citations than controls. Next slide. And there was a similar study done, I think, in 2012 that showed the same thing, essentially a doubling of citations and a doubling, more than a doubling of downloads when an article actually had mainstream press coverage. So, you know, if you want to boost your own scientific metrics, then mainstream media is a good way to do it. And I thought I'd show this conversation article as well, because it's worth having a read of that anytime you like. It's a really good summary of what scientists have to gain by talking to the public. And I think the other reason to talk to the public is really the time that we're in. You know, there's a growing crisis in trust and fake news, and truth is really only as powerful as the trust we have in those that speak it. And trust in the establishment is actually decreasing at the moment. And the only way to counter that is really for scientists to speak up as individuals rather than necessarily relying on, you know, learned bodies or academic organizations to do it for you. Next slide. And just as an example of this, interestingly, trust in the mainstream media has also dropped over the last year. This is some Australian data, but we're seeing same sort of trends around the world. This is the Edelman Trust Barometer, and it showed a significant decrease in trust of pretty much all institutions across the board, but actually trust in the media was one of the biggest ones. Next one, next slide. And the impact of this complete lack of trust is that people are now valuing their peers and their peers' opinions as much as they are that of credible academic experts. So if you look at, again, this is the same data from the Edelman Trust Barometer, but the percentage of people who rate each of these sort of spokespeople rather as extremely or very credible, that a person like you is now just as credible as an academic expert. So people are really listening to their peers and friends and neighbors and what their family shares on Facebook and other social media sites. And so it's really, the onus is on academic experts to really engage with the public directly. Next slide. So the mission of all the science media centres is really to inform discussion and debate on the major issues of the day by bringing evidence-based science into the news media. Next slide. But our sort of underlying philosophy is that it's really the responsibility of scientists to do the media better. And we think that the mainstream media will cover science better when scientists learn how to work with the media better. Next slide. So I just thought I'd give you a couple of examples of how we work and how you can actually change the way a story is presented in the news. So some of you may remember a couple of years ago, the International Agency for Research on Cancer put out a press release that within it classified processed meat as carcinogenic to humans. Interestingly, that sort of category put it in the same class as cigarettes and plutonium and asbestos and all these things that the general public knows are really, really bad for you and cause cancer. But the statement that came out from the International Agency for Research on Cancer really didn't give much in the way of qualifying what the actual risk was of a bacon sandwich versus, you know, standing next to a lump of plutonium. Were they the same? Or, you know, all that category really said is we're pretty sure these things cause cancer, but not how likely you are to get it. And so the upshot of that is, you know, we saw quite a few headlines saying cancer danger in bacon, bacon is as bad as cigarettes, you know, which really wasn't the finding of the report. Next slide. So what we do when we see a report like that come out, we go to experts in cancer from universities and research institutes across the country, show them the report and say, you know, can you give us a quote, particularly around this, what is the risk with eating bacon versus, you know, smoking a cigarette? And so we were able to send journalists some quotes and comments that really clarified some of that risk. And then the journalists can essentially cut and paste and use those comments directly in their story. So the top comment said, red and processed meat accounts for around 2,500 cancer cases a year, whereas tobacco causes 11,000. So that gives you a direct information to journalists about comparing the two. So you can see that once we sent out those quotes and comments, the types of media coverage that included them were really quite different to the sort of shock horror headlines that were initially seen with this report. So lots of talk about you don't need to give up bacon necessarily, that, you know, those initial reports were taken out of context, and importantly, some of the actual statistics around what the risk actually is. So much more informed reporting that's entirely dependent on scientists engaging with that news story. Next slide. I thought I'd also give you a nice example of influencing or, you know, correcting politicians in this case. So I think it was 2016, but the state of South Australia, where we're based, lost all power. So the entire state was blacked out, largely as a result of these giant electricity pylons blowing over in a very, very large storm. Next slide. But the day immediately following this statewide blackout, the politicians in Australia decided it was a good opportunity to blame renewable energy, and particularly South Australia's sort of high investment levels in renewable energy for the blackout. So they you know, immediately jumped onto every news outlet in the country and said the reason the state blacked out was because it's got too much renewable energy. Next slide. So we thought, is that true? Let's go out to some experts and find out if renewables are really to blame. So again, we approached scientists on our database and said, you know, can you respond to these reports that renewables are to blame? What do you think? Next slide, and you can see some of the quotes there. And overwhelmingly, the response from experts was, no, the blackout had nothing to do with renewable energy, and that whether that power was coming from wind turbines or coal, a pylon blows over and it's still going to stop the energy flowing. So as you can see, lots of follow-up stories that essentially said the politicians were wrong, it had nothing to do with renewable energy, and a real sort of correction of misinformation. Next slide. So I think Fran's gone through some basic tips on how you can do this sort of stuff. I wanted to also say that we have an online media training resource called Science Media Savvy. And if you just Google Science Media Savvy, the page should come up. That's free for anyone to use. It's full of tip sheets and videos and experiences of both scientists who've done a lot of media and also journalists, and what they wish scientists knew. It's got some scenarios of TV, radio, and print interviews that went badly and perhaps why they went badly and what could be done to improve them, and also some PDF guides that you can download and keep on hand. There's also a module about social media. So if you're interested in knowing what the difference is between Twitter and Facebook and which one you should be on, and don't know that sort of information, that's a good guide there as well. Next slide. And finally, I just thought I'd talk about the way that we engage a lot of journalists with science and research stories. Again, working similarly, I think, to the Education Media Centre, in that we work with journal publishers like Taylor and Francis, who provide us with access to that embargoed research as it's coming out, and we help say, yes, that's going to be interesting to the local media, or no, it's not. And we actually filter all of that journal content through our website called SIMEX. And for journalists, this is a one-stop shop that they can come to get everything they need on a research story. So the paper will be there, the press release will be there, the scientist contacts will be there, images, video, anything they might need to cover the story. And that's really making it as easy as possible for journalists to cover science. In Australia, in the last 5 years, we've lost about 3,000 journalists from media outlets. And we've now, I think, at the point where we have about 2 science reporters left working at mainstream media outlets. So for a lot of journalists, science is in their main beat. So to make it as easy as possible for them to cover it is really crucial to getting it into the news agenda. Next slide. And this is really my final slide in terms of how you as academics can engage with this space as well. On SIMEX, we also have an expert profile section. But whether you are in Australia and are using SIMEX, or are someone else and are thinking about the way that you profile yourself to journalists, perhaps putting on your university webpage some links to YouTube videos that you've done, or seeing if you can embed your Twitter feed so that any journalist who's looking at that page can see that you are following what's happening in the news, you're reacting to those types of stories. But also, if there's a YouTube video there, they can see that you can talk in plain language and explain difficult concepts simply, and that makes them more likely to contact you for their media inquiries. So that's it for me. I hope I've convinced you to say yes to a journalist next time they call.
Great, thank you very much, Lyndall. Some really interesting figures and statistics in there, and also reassuring to know that we can still eat bacon. So thank you very much for your presentation. If you could mute your microphone, well, I'll hand over to Caroline in South Africa. I'll get your slides up, and then if you'd like to begin.
Thank you. Hi. And thank you for those wonderful presentations, Fran and Lyndall. I'm definitely going to just truncate some of mine because I don't want to repeat what you've already said. Those statistics you gave, Lyndall, on how many journalists have been laid off in science is quite extraordinary. And so I think one of the questions, you've answered one of the questions of why engaging with the media is so important. We know there's massive pressure on newsrooms. You've both referred to the rise of fake news and the rise of the use of social media. And you've both also mentioned the public trust in the media is very low. The corollary to this is that the knowledge produced in universities and research institutions remains trapped within the academy. And Lyndall, as you put it so beautifully with the picture of the world's leaders there, policymakers and the general public really need to know and have access to this expert knowledge. And that's not happening enough, which is, next slide, thanks. So, showcasing academic work. I think you've also both touched on why it's important for academics to get their work into the public domain, to be able to build new networks, to share their knowledge. And we found that the Conversation Africa is about 2.5 years old now. And we've discovered that those networks are beginning to be established both cross-continent and intercontinentally. Again, the point about public policymakers and ultimately the public are the people that you can reach. Building networks of knowledge across Africa. Those networks existed, they exist, but they don't know about one another. And so finding platforms in which this knowledge gets shared means that they can discover one another, and fantastic collaborations are beginning to emerge. As far as the conversation goes, and I'll get to talking about us in a minute, what we enable you to do is to work with professional editors, and what I call what we do a massive translation service, in the sense that we take very complex theories and thoughts and translate them into ordinary English that policymakers and ordinary and the general public can understand. Next slide. So what is the conversation? It was a website created first in Australia in 2011 and followed by the UK, the US, France, and Africa. We also have an Indonesian site and a Canadian site now. And it had a very simple premise at the heart of it, which was it's a website where you bring together the expertise of academics and combine it with the editing ability of journalists. And I think the reason that it's been so extraordinarily successful since its launch in all the geographies it's launched in is because the premise is so absolutely simple. We don't write as the journalists in the relationship. We're purely there as editors. And so we help academics. We literally, I call it bespoke editing. We hold every academic's hand and we take them through a very collaborative editing process. As you can see, it looks like a normal normal news site: arts and culture, business and economy, education, environment and energy, health and medicine, politics and society, science and technology. You have to work for an academic institution to qualify to write for the site. And we do prefer you to have a PhD, though we do publish PhD candidates. If you're early in your PhD, we ask you to write with your supervisor. And we do ask you to write on the subject in which you're doing your PhD. Found the most troublesome academics are either professors emeritus or PhD candidates. Seems at both ends of the spectrum, they think they can write about everything and want to write about everything. And we have to politely decline and say, stick to your knitting. If you know about bones, then write about bones, and writing about history, we're not really interested. Next slide, thanks. So we can actually move on really quickly from this one. This is just where it looks incredibly impressive actually when it's like that. But the Africa site, we've got the entire continent of 54 countries. We've got an office in Johannesburg and an office in Nairobi, and we've just opened an office in Lagos. But to suggest that we cover 54 countries, I think is a bit of a stretch. We're quite strong in Southern Africa, and we're getting stronger in East Africa. And we've just put our toehold into West Africa. We're kind of getting there. But the Australian site, as I mentioned, is the oldest, and then the UK is the second oldest. Okay, next slide. So why would you be interested in doing this as an academic? For one thing, you'll get your own personal little dashboard, and this is what it'll look like. And it'll tell you everything you need to know about the article that you published with us, how many readers you've attracted, where geographically it's been read, and who's republished it. So one of the key things, and I think one of the key underwriting success points of the conversation, is that we publish under Creative Commons, which means that anybody can republish us on two conditions. They don't change it, and there's accreditation for the academic and for the conversation. It means that we're getting extraordinary reach. And the sad side to this is, I think the reason our articles are being republished so much is that newsrooms are shrinking. 95% of the articles that we've published on the Conversation Africa have been republished by at least 3 outlets, which just, the analogy I use is like a sponge. We put the material out there and it just gets soaked up. So you'll see on this, on Leo Brock's dashboard, It's been republished by something called News 24, which is a local news media site here, and Times Live. Tells you how many comments. So every academic gets this personalized dashboard as soon as you've published on the site. And we found that academics completely love it. They get huge pleasure out of it, and it also gives them a sense of what they're reaching throughout the world. Yeah, next slide. The next few slides are on writing tips, and I'm not sure I'm going to spend too much time on them. Both Fran and Lyndall have alluded to this, and both your comments made me giggle quite a bit, because it's very simple, but it's really hard to do. So, I mean, I think I'm not going to speak to these. They're there if you want to look at them. I think the news pyramid one speaks to the fact that academics always put the most important point in the last paragraph. So very often when we're editing an article, we'll be saying to ourselves, why does this matter? Why does this matter? Where am I going? Where am I going? And we'll get to the last paragraph and it will become crystal clear. And I know that that's how it works in academia. So we invert it. I think let's move on to the next slide. This is quite interesting because, I mean, what's lovely about the combination of having us as editors work with academics is that we've just got a really, really different approach. We get to the point and we put the detail in later. We simplify everything. And the readability index, it was an interesting story you told about. We actually edit to a readability index. And it measures length of words and length of sentences, and the index rates your article 0 to 100. When it gets to 80, it turns green, and we don't publish until the readability index is 80. We do get articles that arrive that have a readability index of 0. And they are quite challenging to move from 0 to 80. But everything that we do is about making sure that things are simplified and just explained in the simplest possible way. And our rule of thumb is if we don't understand it, then ordinary readers are going to not understand it. Avoid jargon, avoid over-formal didactic tone. There's a lovely story told recently by someone who was saying to academics, if you're using words that you never used before you became specialized, don't use them. And I thought it was a really interesting rule of thumb, because they're words that academics use that none of us would ever use in normal speech. And they've become used to using them because that's their area of specialization. The last piece of this, what's new, what's the hook? Fran, I think both you and Lyndall mentioned this issue of timing. Kind of if you plugged into the zeitgeist and you know what's going on and you know what people are concerned about, it really, really helps. It helps to answer what I call the so what paragraph in every article. Why am I reading this? Why does it matter? Why does it matter now? Also, not assuming readers' knowledge. It's a huge problem. And we ask, when we're editing, in the first round of editing, very often we'll go back and say, please explain this, and also just provide more detail and provide more context. Provide a comparison. Has this happened anywhere else in the world? Is this brand new? Has anybody else done this? And through asking these questions and getting the academics to answer them, we actually find the articles come alive and become much more interesting. I'm going to finish off with 2 very small impact stories. And they are quite tiny, but I really love them. One is an academic who wrote an article, next slide, yeah. We wrote an article about an academic who'd done research on South Africa's housing policy, which was a very, very generous policy post-apartheid, post-94. And this academic's been looking at it and has come to the conclusion that actually what was designed in 1994 isn't sustainable. And so wrote an article for us and suggested maybe some new thinking. He was contacted by the Deputy Minister for consultations on some of the ideas that he'd. This is a very sensitive subject in South Africa, and the fact that we were able to land the story, or the academic was able to land the story in a way that invited both industry and government to engage with it deeper, we thought was absolutely brilliant. So that was the one. And then the next slide. This is a very quaint little story. So there's an article around Breastfeeding Week. We published a whole lot of them. This academic wrote an article about how we've made huge strides in South Africa and even getting more women to breastfeed, but it's still taboo in public places. So she wrote this article, and the university that she works for then opened a breastfeeding room for the workers and the academics at the university. Small impact, but I just thought, just a wonderful, wonderful little story. Please, to conclude, sign up to our newsletter. You can sign up to all our newsletters. You can get the UK's, Australia's, Africa's, and the US's, and get in touch with us. You'll find our team at the bottom of our front page. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. That was some really interesting information there from you and some really good practical tips, which I'm sure much of our audience will be able to take away with them today. So thank you very much. And again, to our panelists, before we go, we do have time for some questions. So we could ask all the attendees, if you've got some questions, please type them in the questions box. We'll give you a couple of minutes now. We'll stay on the line. We'll ask all our panelists to stay on the line. We'll get your questions in and ask them to the appropriate panelist when they come in. Okay, so we've got a question come in, which I might ask to direct towards Lyndall. Are you able to unmute yourself to answer this one? Okay, let's see. So it says, I'm interested in providing media commentary for my subject area of expertise. Do you have any advice on how I can make myself better known to the press?
Yeah, I think probably developing a social media presence is definitely a good one. You know, the barrier between traditional media and social media is pretty much disintegrated now. So if you are following your area and commenting, retweeting, engaging with other stories that people in your area, and also follow some journalists, tweet them directly is often a good idea if you can contribute to what's happening in the news as it's happening. And really get in touch directly with journalists. Journalists are always keen to hear from scientists. They hear from a lot of PR people on a regular basis, but they don't actually hear directly from academics. So you can absolutely, you know, Google a journalist, find someone at a news outlet that you think writes well about your subject, and email them directly. Most journalists' email addresses are really easy to find, but if you can't find them directly, your media team at your university will definitely know. If there's something happening in the media and you feel like you can contribute, contact your press office at your institution or your media office and say to them, this is what's happening in the news today. I work in this area. I've got something to say about it, because a lot of universities and research organizations will be constantly sending out to the media lists of experts that can comment on that particular topic as well. And if there's a science media center in your country, which we're now in Canada, Germany, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and one's about to open in the US. So if you're in any of those countries, the Science Media Centre in that country will be keen to hear from you too.
Great, thank you very much, Linda. And do either of the other two panelists, Fran or Caroline, have anything to add to that at all? Okay, no problem at all. We will move on. So the final question, which I'll direct towards Caroline, is, do you have any recommendations for using your research to influence policy and practice?
It's a really lovely question. It's an interesting question. I mean, I think the first step is to do that piece of translation, to move from the academic paper and the detail of that into an article that is just accessible and that people can understand. And I mean, if you want to you could work with us with a conversation, because that's what we do as editors. We help you kind of find the nub what might be the most interesting thing that you want in the public domain, or you think is the most important thing to get into the public domain, and to then get the article written, and then to get it published, and then hopefully to get, you know, the follow-ons of the radio interviews or the television interviews, or you know, whatever uptake there is. But I think the biggest step, I don't know, Lyndall and Fran, whether you'd agree with me, but I think the first big step is to take that piece of academic work and find a means of making it digestible, and creating aha moments for ordinary people and policymakers. So they go, okay, take the housing story. I mean, that piece of research could have stayed within the academy forever, but the author wrote it up in a way that showed he'd addressed what was a major concern in society, and he'd come up with solutions. And two very opposite ends of the kind of policy-making spectrum followed up on it. So I would say that would be the first thing for me. That's the big thing. What we find too is once we've done that process with the academic, they very often use the article that we've kind of co-edited with them to produce their presentations on their thesis. They find it a very lovely exercise in terms of getting their thoughts into succinct, clear, concise bullet form. Did that help? I hope.
Yeah, I think it was really useful to know. Thank you, and great to know that there is that service out there for authors if they need it. They can call upon you for some practical tips and to get their research better known in the press. So thank you very much, Caroline, for your answer there. And thank you again to all our panelists. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today, but hopefully you've enjoyed what's been a really useful 45-minute session, be able to start putting into practice some of the insights our experts have shared. If you'd like to explore media engagement further and read in more detail about the themes we've discussed today, have a look at our dedicated webpage where you can find the first part of our media handling guide, alongside a specially selected collection of articles. And if you're a Taylor & Francis Journal editor or an author publishing in a Taylor & Francis Journal, I'd like to draw your attention to our press nomination form. So if you have an article which you think is worthy of press attention, please read carefully through the selection criteria and submit a form highlighting the key message you'd like to see picked up in the media, and we can work with you to form the most effective communications for your article. So thanks again to our panelists for sharing their expertise with us today, and thank you all for joining us. When I end the webinar, a short survey will pop up on your screen asking you a few questions about your experience, so any feedback you have would be much appreciated. I do apologise for the slight technical difficulties we had at times. We will make sure that a recording is circulated of the webinar, and we can re-record Fran's section if that was particularly problematic on the audio, so do keep an eye out for that. So the webinar is now over, so please feel free to disconnect. Thank you very much.